As consideration of the estimates for budget 2013 continue in the National Assembly, the past week has been one with much uncertainty, mixed activities, and of course, it is now public knowledge that there have been quite a number of cuts to the national budget. Joining me to review the activities over the past week are the Honorable Prime Minister Samuel Hines and the Honorable Dr. Ashley Singh, Minister of Finance. Gentlemen, welcome to this discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
First, Minister Singh, a general review of the week. We know Monday the estimates were scheduled to start, but the very first day, things took a little twist.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much, Eddie, for inviting us, and let me in particular thank the Prime Minister for taking time out of his busy schedule to be with us today. Such is the importance that we attach to the issue of the passage of the budget. There are a number of very significant developments this week that I think are cause for reflection and analysis, and in some cases cause for some concern too. The week began with the expectation that we would start consideration of the national estimates, but on what I would call a somewhat inauspicious note, because the estimates were really supposed to be considered from last week Wednesday. And in fact, if parliamentary custom and practice had been followed, the general policy debate which ended on Tuesday would have been followed immediately by consideration of the estimates from Wednesday. That's last week Wednesday. Instead, the opposition used its one-seat majority. The AFC and the APNU came together to demand an unprecedented break in consideration of the estimates. They provided no justification for the need for this break. They've never previously asked for a break like this. They insisted that they be the ones who determine the length of time, the number of hours, the number of days, and indeed even the schedule, the sequence in which agencies were to be considered. Something that really was previously completely unheard of, and the requests they previously never made at all, neither last year, when they already enjoyed their one-seat majority, or on no previous occasion. As it ensued, they used their majority to approve a situation where the estimates would be considered entirely on their terms, and none of the government's views were taken into consideration with respect to the timing and scheduling of the estimates. That's the first point. The second point was that having done that, on Monday when the estimates were scheduled to be commenced, instead of us starting in accordance with the schedule, a debate was accommodated on whether or not the opposition could move amendments to the budget, whether or not they could cut the budget. One might argue, and some have argued, that that debate was itself completely unnecessary and redundant, because the question of whether the National Assembly can effect cuts to the budget is one that was addressed in a written ruling handed down by the Chief Justice, in which he clearly said, in relation to the 2012 budget cut, that the National Assembly acted outside of its constitutional remit. Notwithstanding the existence of the Chief Justice's ruling, the Speaker nevertheless accommodated the debate and handed down a lengthy written ruling of his own, which collided directly and frontally with the Chief Justice's ruling. Essentially, the Speaker said that he, in his estimation, in his opinion, and according to his ruling, the opposition may move cuts to the budget, and essentially the government has to either accept it or withdraw the budget. Quite an astonishing ruling, especially in the face of an authoritative pronouncement by the courts of Guyana. That second significant event having taken place, so the first was the imposition of the opposition's will with no regard being paid to government's views in relation to consideration of the estimates. The second being the promulgation of a ruling by the Speaker in collision with the Chief Justice's previous ruling. Those two prior developments having taken place, the estimates commenced consideration, and we made ourselves available, the government made itself available to answer any questions posed Ministers supplied elaborations, clarifications, explanations, additional documentation where this was requested. And whilst for the greater part these explanations appeared convincing, and the opposition appeared now to find itself in a position where they couldn't possibly justify persisting with their cuts, to our shock and alarm and surprise, they nevertheless persisted with a few cuts that were in fact quite significant. These include and are specifically a cut to the specialty hospital, I can come back to that later, a cut to the capital transfers to GPL, a cut to the allocations to GINA and to NCN. And each one of these I, time permitting, would be happy to elaborate on. But 4 critical entities and interventions, all in the national interest, all in relation to which we were happy to provide any explanation, we were happy to answer any question. There was no question that was left unanswered from amongst those posed by the opposition, none whatsoever. Nevertheless, they persisted with their cuts. They insisted and persisted with their cuts to these entities. Then there were others where, like I said, they found themselves in such an invidious position that they could not possibly persevere with their cuts. So altogether, I would say that it has been a challenging week for us. Important constitutional questions have been raised now. How does one deal with this conflict between the court making a ruling versus the Speaker of the National Assembly making a ruling, and these two branches of the state, branches of the government coming into collision with each other? And then, of course, you have the substantive matter of cuts to important national developmental programs and the developmental, social and developmental consequences of these, and of course the political implications of these, because there has been a very popular rejection of the budget cuts imposed by the opposition. So it's been, I would say it's been an interesting week, a challenging week, and I think it has exposed the opposition's absence of commitment to development and indeed absence of respect for the rule of law, for the Constitution, and indeed for the interests of the people of Guyana.
Well, thank you very much, Minister. Honourable Prime Minister, you've been at least up to Thursday in the House before you took up the post of acting president, and you've been integrally involved in the discussions, in the questioning and so forth. Your view of the past week?
Well, I think that the budget that we have crafted, the Minister of Finance, President, Cabinet as a whole, I think meets very well the needs of our country at this time. It continues what we have been doing in previous budgets, and it introduces some new and significant initiatives also. So I think the budget that was presented is a very difficult budget to be critical of. So I would say that it posed a great challenge to the opposition to persist in many of the cuts that they threatened. Nevertheless, they have persisted in some, as we just spoke to. I am particularly concerned about the cut to the capital allocation for GPL. And I went to quite a bit, to great pains to explain in my debate, my presentation during the debate, that the allocations to GPL are to meet 2 things. One is the suppression of the subsidies, the suppression, of the prices, the tariff that is in effect is below what is required and below what would be determined in a commercial way. Indeed, I think on the average, every kilowatt hour of electricity that GPL provides is subsidized to about $15 on the average each kilowatt hour. So the more electricity GPL provides, the greater the subsidy. So part of it meets that. And then the government, being in the position of owner of GPL, needs to provide the funding for capital projects to expand GPL to meet the growing demand. We saw that The peak demand has risen from about 33 megawatts in 1992 to about 87 megawatts now. That requires expanding generation, also expanding the networks. There are various upgrades that have to be done. And then in running any utility or many capital-intensive businesses, one has to do replacements after the life of certain of the facilities has been expired. So I've gone to great lengths to explain that. So this, for example, in 2013, we are suppressing the tariffs by a total of about $6.4 billion. And also one could easily ascribe the new 26 megawatt Wärtsilä station that is going in at Vredenhoek. I think that that by itself is about over $5 billion or so. So just on those two items alone, there is need for GPL to have this money, for this money to go in GPL. Part as investment or loan, and the other part to meet the suppressed tariffs. In fact, this has been a long-going issue. When we got into government in 1992, we got into the ongoing discussions of the IDB, even then, through the 80s, with the government of the day, the preceding government, the PNC government, on the question of electricity prices. And for, I would say, most of the time there, electricity prices were running at about 70% of what was required. And at that time, with the prevailing world view, there was a very strong position taken by the multilaterals that prices should be the commercially required prices and so on. That has been eased. That has eased back some now. But the other part I pointed out is that our prices in Guyana, the tariffs we charge, and our costs of production are very much within the lower half of what prevails in the Caribbean. When I argue that, and I point out that last June, CARILEC, which is an association of electric utilities of the Caribbean, that CARILEC presentation shows that in the case of domestic prices, Guyana is about fourth in order out of about 16. There is, actually, I think Suriname was the lowest, then Trinidad and Tobago, some other, and then there was Guyana there. So as I have it here, Suriname is about $9 a kilowatt hour. Trinidad and Tobago is averages over 11. Bahamas is about 31. And then you have Guyana at a bit over 53. And then you have a number of other places, about 55. St. Lucia, Guadeloupe, Aruba. You have some people about $80 a kilowatt hour. Antigua, Barbados, Grenada, St. Martin. You have the Turks and Caicos and Cayman at about 95, and you have here very much out Bermuda at about $120 a kilowatt hour. So our prices are not high. Neither the prices we charge people, which is subsidized, nor our costs on the determined commercial pricing that should prevail for electricity. All those are well within the lower half of the Caribbean area. Now I know that from time to time, over many years, when I bring this sort of information to my fellow Guyanese citizens, they often then say, and I understand it, that may be quite okay, but our rates of pay are not as good as these other people. And I also go on to point out that our costs, the costs of electricity generation, are more or less independent of us or anybody else. When you buy fuel, at these times fuel runs up to over 80% easily. And then the other things there are add in the other things that we import, transformers and conductors, insulators, and so on, I would say that maybe 90% of the cost of providing electricity is sourced on the international market, and we have no control of it. It's the same like any other country. The difference, the issue, the thing to take account of is that we are all based here on petroleum, using petroleum sources. Petroleum prices have been increasing rapidly and may continue to increase. And that has driven us to keep on working to bring on the Amaila project. I speak to that because there is a threat to cut the GRIF allocation of some 16 billion Ghana dollars, 80 million US dollars, which the government has committed to put in the pool to accumulate the funding, the total financing of about $840 million for the Amaila project. Now, there has been certain persons, there have been people making representation in the past that hydro projects should only be costing maybe $2 million per megawatt, whilst our installation there, I think, works out close to $6.5 million per megawatt. I think it's quite true. In the past, maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago, prices were lower for the development of hydropower sites. But historically, the lower cost, the most attractive hydropower sites in the world have been developed. And over time now, we are going into the more costly hydropower sites. And I was quite pleased to see a letter to the editor, I think about 3-4 days ago, which gave a history of recent hydropower installations, which showed that 6.5 is in the range of what is occurring now in the world. But that is not maybe the more important thing. We would have been happy for it to have been a much lower unit cost, capital unit cost. But the important thing, I think, is that we would be cutting our cost of generation when Amaila comes in. The cost of generation would be cut by about 1/2. Currently, using diesel to generate electricity, the cost is maybe in the order of 34 cents a kilowatt hour, and that's pretty good for our situation with 1 megawatt units or 2 megawatt units with diesel. And with heavy fuel oil, we are more like maybe 22 cents a kilowatt hour. So, and we've been shifting to more and more heavy fuel oil, maybe 85%, more than 85%. I think this year we're looking to generate electricity to the extent of about 87% through heavy fuel oil. And that would give us a figure in the order of 24, 25 cents average generation cost per kilowatt hour. So we're looking when Amaila comes along to a figure that isn't maybe more than 12 cents a kilowatt hour delivered in Georgetown. And just to say it again, we have the installation at a site in Amaila, and then we have maybe nearly 200 miles of transmission line to come down into Sophia so that the power is delivered into the grid, the network.
PM, but the reality is now, and Finance Minister, you too could add in here. The reality is now the funds, the more than half or about half of what was allocated as a subsidy to GPL, well, in essence, a subsidy to consumers,
yes,
has now been cut. What's the next step?
Well, I think, as I said, I'm perplexed, perturbed, and perplexed, bewildered, and thinking what to do. There are a number of ways that one would need to fill this hole now. Alternatively, one is certainly going towards the commercial price, which, as I said earlier, is a $6.4 billion that we are foregoing now, and if we got there, well, 3-4 months would have passed, so you won't get the full 6.4 billion, but you'll get a good portion there. Cutting back on the planned works is extremely difficult for me to want to contemplate. Even as it is, the GPL wanted to do another $4.74 billion of work that they would have liked to do, but which they would have had to put back anyhow. So to defer more, it's going to be extremely difficult. As I said, I'm bewildered and perplexed, perturbed about it. And my hope is still that there would be some reconsideration and that the allocations would be restored. And let's look just at the capital side there. We have what we're completing this year, the installation, the upgrade of the transmission with some 7 substations going in place. I think we already have 2 of them in place on the west coast. One at Reading Hope and one at Edinburgh, Lenora area. And there are 7 in all that are to go into the system. Our system, our electricity system, has been very elementary, with more or less no substations away from the generating station itself that we don't have. So we have had more or less a long conductor delivering power, which brings a lot of problems. Indeed, when we got into government in 1990, there was a proposal even then, for about $100 million of investment into GPL, which included then 3 substations. At that time, it was thought 3 substations would suffice. Now we're going in with 7, and GPL has had plans to put in at least another one purely on its own. Not to have these upgrades, it's extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult for me to contemplate. There's also, through the IDB assistance, support for strengthening and hardening the networks, particularly in areas where there's a higher propensity to hook on to the lines to steal power. This costs quite a bit, and GPL has been in receiving assistance from the Dominican Republic, the utility, or one of the utilities in the Dominican Republic. And in particular, they too have had the challenges of people's attempts to receive electricity without paying for it, or not paying for all of it that they receive. So they have developed systems. We use moral suasion, and we are going to continue to use moral suasion. And most of all, we want to call on those people who don't steal electricity. Maybe 5, 6, 7 out of people don't steal electricity for everyone that does. So we like to get the majority to press the minority about stealing electricity. And some time ago, we put in more stringent laws, so people can be sent to jail, mandatory for a 3rd conviction. And eventually one hardens the networks, but it raises cost per household installation, raises the cost by maybe 5-fold, from maybe $60,000 in a built-out area to $300,000. You can go to the extent of having a transformer in a local area that's metered. The power to the transformer itself is metered, and then the individual households, maybe between 10 and 20, the meters may be on the transformer or near to it, and then you can have circuitry between these transformers, computer circuitry in the various meters. So the main meter on the transformer, for the transformer, that flow, that current power flow is added up. You add up the households around the meters, and then if it's out for 15 minutes by more than 5% or some number, the transformer is cut off, and that area is without power. You can get there, but it as you can think, it raises the cost and things like that.
Yes, PM, because these are plans that you have, but the monies have been cut. But Finance Minister, I want to bring you in here because of the fact that the reality is the cost will, the rates will, the tariff may have to be increased to recover this cost. And it will impact not only on the average man, but it will have an impact too on investment.
Well, let me say this, that you asked the question, what next? And there are many perspectives from which this question can be viewed. First of all, from the constitutional and legal perspective, one can consider the question, what next? In light of the Chief Justice's ruling, in light of the Chief Justice's imminent final ruling on this matter, in light of what is clearly stated in our Constitution on these issues, it is inevitable that at some point in time the legality and constitutionality of the National Assembly in effecting these cuts will have to be determined. So, in answering the question, what next? And in considering all of the cuts, that is an eventuality that I anticipate will evolve. What next in relation to all of the cuts, their legality and their constitutionality? That's the first perspective from which one can approach this question of what next. But secondly, from GPL's perspective, these are critical investments, and the Prime Minister is as much a distinguished politician as he is also a distinguished engineer, and he knows the system. He spoke comprehensively just now and in Parliament about why these investments are so critical. And inevitably GPL will have to consider, subject to its ministerial and subject to cabinet guidance and policy directive, what next from the GPL standpoint. Can these investments be postponed? The answer to that question is very simple. If these investments are to be postponed, which the imposition of these cuts will threaten as a necessity, then ultimately the customer must suffer. Right now there are tens of thousands, almost 170,000 GPL customers who face occasional blackouts, sometimes not so occasional blackouts, who face the frustrations of interruptions to their electricity power. In business, you have businesses carrying the cost of interruptions in power. Most businesses have to invest in redundant power. If you have a manufacturing business, you have the carrying cost of redundant power because you can't afford your manufacturing line to go down. You lose a whole manufacturing run if you have an interruption. You have the reality that all of these people, businesses and customers, are paying already electricity rates that are higher than we would like them to be, that they would like them to be, comparatively higher than the region as well. If these investments were to be postponed, then this situation will not get better. On the contrary, it will probably get worse. The aging generation capacity, the outdated transmission and distribution network that the Prime Minister spoke about will come under strain inevitably if these investments are not made. Alternatively, if, based on an objective assessment, the postponement of these investments cannot be contemplated, and that's a very real possibility, then the GPL will then have to confront the question of how will they finance these investments. And in the absence of a central government transfer to GPL, in the amount that was proposed, the only alternative is an increase in tariffs. The only alternative is an increase in tariffs, which will have to be borne by the customers. And so those are the options that are essentially available to GPL. Postponement of this investment, which will probably inevitably mean more unreliable power, more blackouts, or an increase in tariffs to make the investment that is required. And that's the reality. That's the reality.
I want to take you over now to finance minister to the specialty hospital. Despite a whole host of questions were asked, answered, but the monies were cut.
Well, let me say this, that particular cut in the budget is rather astonishing from a number of perspectives. First of all, the merits of the project. Right now, specialized healthcare at that level is not available in Guyana. Guyanese typically have to travel overseas. Very few of us can afford to do that. That involves time. Sometimes that can be fatal. And in most cases, like I said, issues of cost and access will even, remove the issue of time. Reality is that specialized healthcare at that level is not available. Now, maybe to a few wealthy people, I know the opposition has a number of very prominent and affluent lawyers and so on, maybe that doesn't matter. But to the average ordinary Guyanese person, they do not have access to this kind of medical care. And oftentimes, Guyanese people lose their lives because of this lack of access. So you have the merits of the project. Nobody who's committed to the people of Guyana can question the need for a specialty hospital to be built. Nobody can question it. Then you have the reality, the fact, that this hospital didn't enter the budgetary cycle in 2013. This hospital was budgeted in 2012, and indeed, if I'm not mistaken, there may have been a preliminary allocation even in 2011.
I think so.
Certainly in 2012, I believe there was an initial. In 2011, there was an initial allocation.
Something.
In 2012, for sure, there was an allocation approved by the parliament, controlled by the opposition. There was an allocation in 2012. As a result of that allocation being approved by the National Assembly, a legally binding contract was executed with a company following a procurement process. Arising out of that contract, a mobilization advance was paid to this company. Those facts emerged during the course of the debate. The fact that it is a legally binding contract and the fact that a mobilization advance was paid. That question was asked and it was answered recently, just a few days ago. Then you have the issue that Mr. Ramjatan, who moved the cut, may wish to raise, that is the procurement process. Well, it is well known that the award to a particular contract was publicly debated because apparently there was one bidder who felt aggrieved and felt that the contract should have been awarded to them. In fact, they knew that the contract was going to this other company. Somehow they were of the impression they would get it. And they were aggrieved by the fact that they didn't. Made much of a public fuss. The matter was ventilated publicly. What is significant is that that so-called aggrieved company did not pursue the remedies that are available to it under the bid protest process. The Procurement Act has a certain process. If you're concerned about an award or you feel that you're treated unfairly or you feel aggrieved, you register a protest, you follow a certain process. That company did not follow that process. No point in time. Perhaps they saw that there was no merit in their arguments. Perhaps they recognized that the evaluation was professionally done, competently and professionally so, whatever the reason. Then on top of that you have a fact that appears to have escaped notice, and that is that Mr. Ramjatan has a vested interest in this matter. Mr. Ramjatan is on public record as being the lawyer. He said so himself publicly. He said he is the legal representative of the so-called aggrieved bidder. So he's a legal representative of an aggrieved bidder who did not get a contract. Another company got a contract on the basis of a properly approved allocation last year. A mobilization advance is paid to that company. The company now has to commence work and commence construction and be paid, and monies are budgeted this year. And Mr. Ramjatan moves a motion to cut those monies to zero. Those facts are there for all to see and to judge. I think it's significant to note that this is not the first time that Mr. Ramjatan finds himself in this situation. It is well known that the Alliance for Change, led by Mr. Ramjatan, has been stridently objecting to the Marriott project. And it is equally well known that they enjoy a special relationship with the owner of the main competitor to the Marriott, or to the eventual Marriott, that is the owner of the Pegasus Hotel, who publicly endorsed them politically and is widely known to be a strong supporter of the AFC. In fact, recently spoke at or was slated to speak at an AFC event. So this is not the first time that Mr. Ramjatan and the AFC find themselves in this position of using their seat in the parliament and using their vote in the parliament ostensibly to advocate a special interest. And that too is an extremely alarming, raises very important ethical issues, and issues that will have to be confronted by the parliament.
I want to take you quickly because we're slipping out of time, but I want us to examine a few of the other areas. At least there are two other areas that were cut and a few that were threatened. NCN and GINA. In particular, GINA. I know Mr. Ramjatan and the entire opposition made it clear that as long as questions are asked and answers are provided, they'll reconsider the cuts. But in the case of GINA, I was in Parliament at the moment, and I know for a fact that there wasn't a single question on GINA.
Correct. Well, not only was there no question on GINA, but here again you have clear evidence of double standards. GINA is not a concoction of the People's Progressive Party, or indeed of Guyana, that model of a government information service. There has been a government information service in Guyana predating our independence. There was a British Guyana Government Information Service, BGGIS. There was a Government Information Service post-independence. There was a government Guyana Public Communications Agency, GPCA, that performed essentially the same function. And post-1992, 1993, I think there was a GIS and then renamed GINA. In many, many countries across the Caribbean and across the world, you have a government information service. And if we examine what GINA does, GINA goes to the core of bridging the information gap between the citizenry and their government. GINA ensures that the citizens of Guyana know every day where their president is, what their president is doing, what their president's policy pronouncements are, what his speeches are, what he says, where his ministers are, what they're doing. That is public information within the context of an open government that is committed to ensuring an informed citizenry. Citizens need to know, what is my president doing? What are my ministers' policy positions on certain matters? And every day GINA ensures that the citizens of Guyana are informed on government policy so they can make their own informed judgment. Every day GINA does that. You look at GINA's bulletins, look at the things that they produce. Every day they ensure that the citizens of Guyana are provided with information on the activities of government so that they can form their own judgment. So that they can say to themselves, well, I think I agree with the president on this policy position, or I don't agree with him in some respect. GINA's productions are available to all of the media. And so their potential dissemination is wide, nationwide. And the existence of GINA goes to the core of an informed citizenry, a citizenry that is kept informed of the work of their government. And that's an extremely critical function. You can't say that you want an informed citizenry on the other hand, but you don't want a government information agency. The two don't sit together. Much the same can be said about NCN. NCN is a public interest, public service broadcaster. You have this model elsewhere, many, many other countries. If you look at the spectrum of national television stations that are freely and publicly available, no station produces public service announcements, documentaries, local cultural programs, like NCN does. Sports carries national sporting events, national cultural events. NCN does that. No other television station does that in Guyana. That also goes to the core of public service broadcasting, but also, in particular, an informed citizenry. You can't have it both ways. You can't say you want an informed citizenry, but you don't want these entities to do their work. And I think the cut to these two entities discloses again the double standards of the opposition. And I will say to you that the public response has been one of rejection. Everywhere I go, people say to me, well, what does this mean? Wouldn't we be able to go and get cricket on the television anymore? Wouldn't we be able to see all the cultural programs that we see on NCN anymore? Will I no longer be able to go to the GINA website and see what the president is doing. Everywhere I go, I've been bombarded with questions like this. The public rejection of these cuts has been overwhelming, not just GINA and NCN, specialty hospital, electricity. The public voice is loud on these matters. And indeed, I say loud and clear.
Apart from those are the entities that were hit, or projects that were hit in terms of the cut, but there were attempts, PM, to tackle a few other areas, including the Office of the First Lady, as well as the Sports and Art Development Fund, and so forth.
I think the Office of the First Lady really saw the two parties going back and forth on it. I think in these times, as Minister Priya Manik Chand had been saying in her comment, in these times, having a First Lady that has some particular platforms, particularly about the family and improving the family, it's something that we should welcome. And the allocation of $10 million is not a huge sum. So why would they want to? Why would they have wanted to cut it? I think too that in the Ministry of Culture, Youth and Sport, they're saying before that they were going to cut. I think it is the
Sport and Art Development Fund.
Art and
Sport Development
Sport
Fund.
and Art Development Fund. Again, I couldn't make any sense of that. I think we had recently a very successful art competition where some 200 pieces of painting and sculpture were, I think, were provided, were prepared and presented, and I think they were very well thought of. I think that these sort of activities promote the artistic skill of our people. They give them cause to pursue their innate talents in this area. And again, these sort of things should be welcomed. I'm glad to see that finally better sense prevailed and these items were not cut.
Minister Singh, I think yesterday, Friday, there was much uncertainty as it relates to the Ministry of Home Affairs. In particular, the citizen security program that was earmarked to be reviewed. Your view on what happened yesterday?
Well, what we saw yesterday was a rare occasion on which the opposition actually recognized the phenomenal public pressure that they're under. And they bowed to that pressure, in the AFC in particular. Because let me say this, that any attempt to cut allocations to the security sector would have met with a howl of rage from the people of Guyana. Any attempt to cut this allocation. So make no mistake about it. They recognize this. They recognize that they would have been in an indefensible position. In fact, the mere attempt to cut programs like the Citizen Security Program was met with disbelief by the people of Guyana. So what you witnessed yesterday was, in fact, a very reluctant acceptance on the part, really, of the AFC. Like I said, the APNU still persisted. But a very reluctant acceptance on the part of the AFC that they would have been rejected even more resoundingly by the people of Guyana had they persisted with these cuts. The people of Guyana would not have accepted and will not accept a cut to the security sector allocation, and they recognize it. They recognize the political folly and that they would have been committed and the political perils that they would have faced.
Gentlemen, I want to take you, we have just a few more days, between 2 to 3 days more for the continuation or the conclusion of the considerations. But there was a last minute activity again yesterday. In addition to the GRIF, etc., that were earmarked for cuts in the motions, the one by the Dr. Scarborough and the one by Mr. Ramjatan. Mr. Greenwich, I think, circulated another piece proposing a 130 million cut to the Ministry of Housing, in particular the Central Housing and Planning Authority. Looking forward to the few days that are left.
Well, let me say this, that the cut being proposed by Mr. Greenwich to the Central Housing and Planning Authority is much like so many of the other cuts that he's proposed. Recall Mr. Greenwich proposed cuts to the Specialty Hospital. He proposed cuts to the Sports and Arts Development Fund. He proposed cuts to the
GPL.
Board of Industrial Training. He proposed cuts to GPL. He now proposed a cut to the Central Housing and Planning Authority. There's a constant theme running through all of these. These go to the core of development. The Board of Industrial Training trains thousands of young disadvantaged youth every year. The Central Housing and Planning Authority has an important mandate to develop new housing areas. These projects go to the core of national well-being and individual well-being in this country. And I don't know by what stretch of the imagination Mr. Greenwich believes that he's going to be able to persist with these cuts without being rejected roundly by the people of Guyana. It's unbelievable. They are all important social and developmental programs. All. I will say this though, that it does give one a window into the past. Bear in mind that these cuts are being perpetrated by Mr. Carl Greenwich. Bear in mind too that Mr. Carl Greenwich was finance minister from 1983 to 1992, the worst years of Guyana's economic performance, the years during which our infrastructure collapsed, the years during which our social programs collapsed, the years during which our schools ended up being without chalk and without basic supplies and without books, and our hospitals ended up being without medicines. Mr. Carl Greenwich was the finance minister who presided over that decline. That's important. Even when Mr. Greenwich was a minister, his policies did not reflect a concern for the people of Guyana. There was no national housing program. There were no house developments like we have today, where tens of thousands of Guyanese people having access to their own plots of land. Even as a minister, Mr. Greenwich displayed no particular empathy for the people of Guyana, or no particular concern for developmental projects like this. He presided over the collapse of the economy of Guyana from 1983 to 1992, and he presided over the dilapidation of our economic and social infrastructure as minister from the period 1983 to 1992. Mr. Greenwich likes to be remembered for the period 1989 to 1992. He wants to be remembered for the economic recovery program and so on. But it mustn't be forgotten that he was the Minister of Finance that created the conditions that made the ERP necessary. He was also Finance Minister from 1983 to 1989, prior to the ERP, and during which the rot set in. So he presided as Finance Minister over the decay and collapse of the Guyanese economy. And that is an inescapable fact. So my final word would be, perhaps we shouldn't be so surprised at these cuts, and in particular we shouldn't be so surprised given where they're coming from.
PM, the GRIF 2 is earmarked for cuts.
Yes, that is a big concern to me because of we look to it to bring cheaper electricity in the future, significantly cheaper electricity in the future. I hope that by the time it comes up, better sense will prevail, and that the GRIF would not be chopped. As we know, this is money that we have earned in the course of our approach to maintaining our forests, avoiding deforestation and degradation, utilizing our forests, but utilizing our forests in a sustainable way. And this is payment for environmental services. I think this is a very important model for the world as a whole, and I do hope that better sense will prevail by the time it comes up.
Gentlemen, this is where we have to wrap this here, but I'll give you maybe about 30 seconds to your final call as it relates to the consideration of the remainder of the estimates.
Well, my final word would be to say this, that the last agency we considered was the Ministry of Home Affairs. And we saw popular pressure and popular concern about citizen security, resulting in the opposition backpedaling and demonstrating some reluctance to proceed with the cuts. That was the last agency we considered. I hope that they have received the message loud and clear from the people of Guyana, who have spoken. I hope they have heard the message. And I hope that they will not persist with the highly unpopular and strongly anti-development future cuts that they're proposing over the next few days.
Yes, I think going back to the debate, we spoke about the fact that we have had 7 years, we've been able to manage 7 years of continuous growth against the background of problems in the international world and also in the region. And so we must be doing something right. And I would like us to keep on this same path. I'd like everyone in Guyana to support this budget. Maybe not just supporters of PPPC, or doesn't mean you're a supporter, but you're supporting the continued growth and development of our country.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you very much, Honorable Prime Minister and Finance Minister, and I close with sharing your sentiment. I hope good sense prevail. Come the
Thank you very much.
continuation.
Thank you very much, Eddie.